One of the strangest parts of language learning is realizing that you can understand much more than you can actually speak. Sometimes you read a sentence and understand it immediately. But when you try to say something yourself, your brain suddenly goes completely blank. And I think that's a real interesting part of the learning process. I notice this especially with Spanish. Reading and listening feels easier, but speaking still feels much harder. And I think a lot of language learners experience this at some point. You start recognizing words, understanding more context, and following conversations more easily. But when you try to actively speak, it suddenly feels like you know much less than you thought. I think part of this happens because understanding and speaking are actually two very different skills. When you read or listen, your brain mainly has to recognize information. You see a word and think, oh, I know what that means. But speaking is different. You have to actively find the words, build sentences, remember grammar, and react in real time. And that is much more difficult. I've noticed this a lot recently while working with Spanish. Sometimes I can read something and understand most of it without translating every single word. Or I listen to something and suddenly realize, wait, I actually understood that. But if I try to explain my own thoughts in Spanish, it still feels much slower and more difficult, and sometimes even impossible. It's a strange feeling because your understanding improves first, but your speaking doesn't always immediately follow at the same speed. And honestly, I think this probably also happens when we learn our first language. Children understand much more before they can actually say it themselves. They hear words and sentences over and over again long before they start speaking fluently. So, in a way, this difference between understanding and speaking is probably a very normal part of language learning in general. I think this stage can sometimes feel frustrating because understanding is a quieter form of progress. Speaking feels more visible, it feels easier to notice, but understanding more is still real progress, even if it doesn't always feel as dramatic. So, even though it sometimes feels strange to understand more than you can actively say, I think that's actually a very normal part of learning a language. And honestly, it's also one of the most interesting parts of the process. I'm curious if other language learners experience this too. Do you also understand more than you can actively speak in your target language?